Well, thank you so much, Magdalena, and thank you to Einörð and the EXTOR project for hosting me in this. I don't know if I will answer to you what the buzzwords truly mean, but maybe I will attempt to make it a little bit more complex. And what I really want to explore is what it means when we think of them in a certain way, and what are the consequences of how we think of them. So that's maybe more of something I'll attempt in a Thursday morning than to answer what they truly mean. You will have to figure that out for yourselves, I suppose. And as Magdalena mentioned, I work with this innovation laboratory called East of Moon, where we study innovation and creativity from the point of view of communities. And in this session, we'll focus on rural communities. I had the pleasure, as Magdalena said, of working together with her on a project called Fostering Innovation Ecosystems in Rural Iceland. And this is a picture that we commissioned, which we called Home Town Moonshots, which was kind of an attempt to widen our imagination of what innovation in rural areas means and think about that kind of from different angles. And I'll be sharing with you some of the takeaways from that and some of the questions that I've been working with in terms of innovation. So the title of this talk, as you know, is What We Think of When We Think of Innovation. And again, I won't give you the true definitions and the true meanings, but I will give you, hopefully, a bit of a thought process of what are the consequences of how we think of these words. I'll let you hear a little bit about how the word innovation is used before we delve into it, just as a refresher.
As a world-leading hub for science and innovation.
See, Apple was a company that was based on innovation.
To another innovation, the digitalization of milk production.
China has overtaken the United States in several key innovative sectors.
Scale up innovation solutions and uses them in a bigger scale.
User-centered orientation, social innovation, data-driven policy and decision-making.
Innovative Solutions Canada, an innovative low-cost treatment plant.
So that you may go and change the world.
Innovation can happen anywhere.
So the first thing to note, if we look at how this word is used, is that it is almost always used in a value positive way. If I were to say that a particular country or a company or even a person is not very innovative, you would kind of assume that I'm talking badly of them. So we sort of assume that innovation is good and not innovation is therefore bad. There are almost no mainstream political parties that don't want to have more innovation. Every single region in Iceland and across Europe wants to have more innovation in their area. Every company is trying to be more innovative. So one of the consequences of this is that there is usually not so much of a discussion, a critical discussion of what we mean when we say innovation. And, do we want to have more of it, and what kind of innovation do we want, and what do we think of when we think of innovation, going back to the title. So I am going to throw at you a bit of a controversial line, which I took from the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose, which is an institute in London that really thinks very critically about innovation and society and the state, where we attended an event this summer, which is innovation is political. You would not think that beyond perhaps politicians saying we want more innovation, more unicorns, more growth, more startups, more innovation. And for a very good reason, I think saying that innovation is political puts us on edge and makes us a bit defensive. Does this mean that an innovation always has to be part of some sort of a strong ideology? Or does this mean that political parties should be deciding what gets innovated and in what direction does the innovation go? I think we're, for a very good reason, skeptical about trying to steer innovation from above, which is how we think of politics often. I think most creative people who have been part of making something new, where exploration and serendipity is a huge part of it, I think we're all, by our own nature, anarchists when it comes to innovation or art or creativity. We don't want it to be steered from anywhere. So I am not necessarily advocating for that when I join in on the slogan that innovation is political. What I am rather trying to emphasize is that if we do believe that innovation is creating the world of tomorrow, if we think that it has consequences for society, then to a large extent, how we approach innovation, how we support it, where we direct it to, has political consequences. And what I'll try to attempt to share with you or argue with you in the next few minutes is every single time when we talk about the innovation ecosystem and we make decisions about how we approach innovation, we're making political decisions, and there is no way around that. All right, so those of you who have listened to me talk before about this topic, you might know that my favorite definition of innovation comes from the driest organization in the world called the International Standards Organization. They define innovation as a new or changed entity realizing or redistributing value. This is the ISO 56000:2025 standard, if you want to look it up. It's a fascinating read. Look it up, read it, read all the footnotes. It's a really good definition. And if there ever was a true definition of innovation, as Magdalena called for in the beginning, that this would be it. But I'd like to use this as a starting point for our conversation. So it's something that is something new or changed that realizes or redistributes value. And so what do we think of when we think of new or changed entities realizing or redistributing value? What does this word mean for us? And what does it mean when we think that value means money, for example? This is a bit of a complicated topic. We often assume that the role of innovation is to create economic growth or money. Again, this is not necessarily something that is debated a lot of the time within the innovation ecosystem or within innovation circles. It's just something that's assumed. And obviously, we often measure value in money. We see economic growth as a proxy for value increasing. But we have many examples of companies creating a lot of economic growth, but not a lot of value. We see a big part of the technology ecosystem today being more of a rent extractor. The Amazon, the Meta, the Google are taking away value, but creating a lot of growth. So we cannot conflate those things. And secondly, we cannot assume that if there is no economic growth or money is not being exchanged, that no value is being created. Every single December, my daughter is so excited to see the big sculpture of the Christmas cat downtown Reykjavik. This is a sculpture that was put up, it was paid for, but then year after year, it generates value in the form of public enjoyment where thousands of people walk past it and see it and enjoy it, and there is no money being exchanged. So if we assume that value means money, there are certain consequences. So what is value? What is valuable is a question that we don't necessarily ask ourselves in the context of innovation. One answer to this is that value is something that meets human needs. And so, one framing of this is this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Whether you see it like this pyramid or something else is a matter for psychologists, I suppose, and we won't go into that. But just to ground ourselves in the fact that whether the innovation we do is put on display for the public to see with exchanging money, or whether it generates economic growth, in the end of the day, the value should be about meeting human needs. And this forces us to talk about our values. What do we value? And so we create all kinds of resources and capital which are not necessarily economical, but might be cultural, symbolic, and social, which we should keep in mind. The second thing that happens when we think that about innovation and we think that new is a new thing, exploring how we think about innovation again. Is innovation a new thing? And I'm asking this to challenge us to think about innovation maybe in a more of a systematic way. In the 1970s, Kodak created a digital camera. And it didn't go very far. It wasn't very technologically advanced. They created a new thing. It was a digital camera. It wasn't very usable. Part of why it wasn't very usable is because the underlying technology for digital cameras weren't very far ahead. So you could only take 5 pictures on it. It was very grainy and small, but they did make this thing. But let's imagine for a moment that they had made a perfectly technologically advanced digital camera back in the 70s, with all the most advanced functions, being able to take hundreds of pictures in high resolution. Would it have been a usable innovation? And the answer is it wouldn't. It's not possible to use a perfect thing of an innovation in the 70s with the society that is there. For there to be the innovation of a digital camera, there need to be certain social consequences or social circumstances. There needs to be the infrastructure of the internet to send the pictures from person to person. Everyone has to have a computer screen in their homes. Otherwise, what's the point of having the photos digitally? People will have to have adopted the habit of carrying around phones around them. So it's only when society has sort of created the circumstances for digital cameras that these inventions can become innovations. And often there needs to be certain cultural shifts, certain habits, certain infrastructure, either technological or social. There even needs to be sometimes changes to regulations and rules and laws and the way that we govern society in order for innovations to be possible. So I'm putting it like this to emphasize that innovation isn't a new thing. A new thing is an invention, but innovation is something that society in its whole adopts and creates. And this has very important consequences for rural areas, because rural areas often don't have all these different infrastructures, all these different conditions that allow for innovation to happen. And so often what innovation in rural areas consists of is finding ways of introducing something that isn't a new thing in the world, but finding ways to introducing that in the circumstances that they find themselves in. So just as innovation and discussion of innovation cannot be separated from what is valuable, at the same time, the discussion of what is innovative cannot be separated from the social context that it comes from. What does it mean when we think that the entrepreneur, the person who innovates, is a businessman? This is, again, often something that is assumed, not debated. The original definition of an entrepreneur from 200 years ago from Jean-Baptiste Say is someone who moves around economic resources, land or natural resources, labor, capital, who moves them around from something that's less productive to something that's more productive, moves it around from something that creates less value, meeting human needs, to something that meets more human needs. And if we part from this definition, and again, we rarely talk about definitions when we talk about entrepreneurship, then we have to conclude that the entrepreneur is not necessarily a businessman. The entrepreneur can be a government that can push the economy towards certain sectors or certain directions, like the so-called innovation government of the post-World War II in Iceland, which pushed Iceland's fishing industry into more productive and value-creating form. We also have to conclude that the entrepreneur can be a non-profit organization. Even something like the women's organizations of Iceland, which pushed economic resources, collected them through whatever means they had to raise money and put them into health institutions or other kind of social benefit entities. These organizations were truly entrepreneurial in the sense, if we do look at the definition. So, what does it mean if we think that the entrepreneur is a businessman only? Well, we are only seeing the top of the iceberg. What does it mean when we think that innovation should create jobs? In Icelandic countryside specifically, this is almost an obsession. The idea that we must be creating jobs is taken for granted, is part of every single policy document, even in areas where, on the whole, there is no unemployment to speak of. Obviously, there are examples in Icelandic countryside where locally there are economic disasters where a fish factory goes away or tourism changes and there is a huge need to create jobs. But on the whole, that is not always the case. So what does it mean if we think that the role of innovation is to create jobs? Well, it usually means that we are not doing innovation. Whether we like it or not, innovation is often in the business of reducing jobs. The automation that innovation introduces, like we saw in the fishing industry, where we have a fraction of the number of workers that produce the same amount of tons of fish in the last 20, 30 years. That is all due to innovation. That is due to innovation and in the technology, in the machines, but also remembering that innovation is always in a social context. That is also part of the change of the legislation, of the introducing of the quota system, the capitalization of that industry, and the concentration of wealth. And so, if we think that innovation is not necessarily creating jobs, but taking them away, this opens up for us a conversation about, well, if we produce more with innovation, who is capturing the value from that? Which towns or regions are now having a booming fish industry? And what happens to the places that lost their livelihood because of the processes of innovation? So it matters if we think about innovation as something that creates jobs, or more correctly, something that takes away jobs. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to take away jobs, but it invites us for a conversation of, well, what we make, the surplus that happens when we create more with less people, where does it go to? Who is the beneficiary and who is the loser of this? We think often of innovation as something that should solve local challenges. And this is coming from a good place, I think. I think the assumption is that, we should use innovation to help the people of Grundarfjörður figure out what are the challenges, what they have to do to make their lives better, and then use innovation to fix that. And that is not necessarily a bad thing to do. But a place like Grundarfjörður, a fishing village, was not born to create value through fishing for the people in Grundarfjörður to consume the fish. So a fishing village creates far more fish than anyone in that village can consume. So because we live in a global world, usually what innovation revolves around on a local level is communities figuring out a way not just to solve or to meet human needs there, but figuring out a way to create value or meet human needs which are global. So in the case of a fishing village, they will almost certainly sell the fish globally. They are meeting the human need of somebody in Manchester who likes to eat fish and chips. When we engage in tourism, we are meeting the needs of a German bank clerk who wants to see something beautiful and exciting. So sometimes the frame of meeting local needs can be also limiting if we think of it like that. When we think that innovation should be based on local strengths, this is also something that gets thrown around without very much discussion. This is often associated with this here, which is the SWOT. The strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats. And what it sometimes does is it freezes us in our own definitions of ourselves. So by defining what are our strengths, we are often perpetuating our own self-image and our own myth of who we are, rather than breaking out of it. So if we think that innovation should be based on local strengths, often what we're doing is the opposite of innovation. We are simply moving forward with the same path that defined us in the past. And what we should be trying to do is we should be doing the reverse SWOT of trying to figure out a way to turn our weaknesses into strengths and strengths into weaknesses. And we can define opportunities and threats on a local level, but usually these are big global trends that we can't really do much about. So the only way to kind of react to them is to find a way to turn them into strengths. All right. This was an exploration of assumptions, an exploration of things that we say, which we can or cannot agree with, and all of them have their own merits, but to try to kind of challenge us about how we think about it. And so another assumption that is often made implicitly, not necessarily discussed, is that innovation should be done by those who are the most innovative, however we define that. And this we do often with the mechanisms in which we support innovation. And this has led to what academics have called the regional innovation paradox, which is something that anyone who has thought about innovation in rural areas has come across, which is the fact that if we have funds that require us to apply to and show our competencies in innovation, then those areas who have the most innovation will then receive the most support. Because the areas that have the least tradition of innovation, have the least prior experience, the networks, the connections, the know-how of how to do innovation, they are then going to get the least support. And there may be a case for let's support those that are the most competitive or the most competent in doing innovation. But is that always the best way? So one way to criticize that position is a moral one. Shouldn't everyone be allowed to do innovation? What about us in the East or the West or the North? But even from the point of view of opportunities for the society as a whole, we can perhaps wonder whether it is precisely those places who are not experienced with innovation, who don't know how to make a brilliant application, who don't have all the collaborative partners. Maybe this is where there are underexplored opportunities, where there are resources, there is know-how, there is culture, which could be used for innovation, but isn't being used for it. And the money isn't flowing there because we have defined the preconditions for doing innovation as being already good at it. Okay, so looking at how these assumptions, these ways of thinking about innovation materialize in practice. This is not going to be a deep dive. I'm going to take a few examples of this. And one of the principal instruments that the Icelandic state uses to support innovation is the Technology Development Fund. This is the grown-up money for a startup, for an innovative company. This is the 60 million or something like that. And I've looked at some of the criteria that the Technology Development Fund puts forward. Now, we may agree or disagree with them. This may be a good way or a bad way to do support for innovation. But I do want to highlight the assumptions that are behind it. And so if you look at the criteria for what gets funded from the Technology Development Fund, you will see that there are principally three categories: novelty, impact, and execution. And I have cherry-picked here. I have taken some points out of it. I didn't show you the whole document, so just be mindful of that. So what is the definition of new that the Technology Development Fund uses? The biggest score for an application to the Technology Development Fund is that what is being applied for meets a new and previously unmet need globally. And so remember that Kodak's digital camera would definitely have met a new and previously unmet need globally in the 70s. But if you are in a rural area where what you're doing is you're taking something that is not necessarily new in the world, but you're figuring out a way to make it work in your context, almost certainly your application will not get a high score in novelty there. So novelty here is introduced as a new thing or process, not necessarily figuring out how to use something in a new context. Okay, so the second one is impact. So there's a little bit of ambiguity here, but the greatest score for the Tech Development Fund is something that has great potential for turnover/value to be expected from a product on the market. And so you need to be doing something that has monetary return, that is has an exchange value on the market. There are some footnotes that, if it saves money for Icelandic users or something like that, it can be still getting a high score in impact. But it is very much geared towards economic value. So that is the assumption about innovation that is made there in that fund. And execution. The value of collaboration for the project and participants is high. Now, this is that bit is part of it. There are many other criteria for execution. By the way, I've just picked that one. But let's look at that one. How easy it is if you are in Raufarhöfn to find collaboration for the project that has a high value for it. versus if you are in Vesturbær. Clearly, this is geared towards communities and people who are already connected, who already have access to stakeholders, to networks. So whether we like it or not, it may be a good idea or not, we are thinking about innovation in a certain way here. All right, so kind of quickly, the main way in which the government now supports innovation and which has grown tremendously is not actually through the Tech Development Fund or through competitive grant allocation, but it's through the so-called tax incentives, where a significant part of the investment in research and development that companies make is paid back from the government. And obviously, this is also, and by the way, just to highlight, this has grown tremendously and is huge amounts of money now that goes through to the private sector through this. And so this is obviously thinking about innovation in a certain way, whether that's explained somewhere or debated somewhere or something like that. So in order to get this money from the government, you will already have to have a lot of money to spend. And this money cannot come from public sources. So how do you get money to spend on research and development? Well, you have someone who is able and interested to invest in you to get their money back. So this is clearly a scheme that aims at supporting those who are big to become bigger. This is clearly a scheme that assumes that innovation has a monetary value. It's clearly a scheme that aims at those who have access to venture capital and so forth. So very much thinking about innovation in a specific way. Finally, just to look at our kind of perspective from the point of rural areas, my favorite policy instrument is the Uppbyggingarsjóðir landshlutanna, the regional development funds. And I really like them. I like them because they don't make always so many assumptions about how innovation is. They can support a broad range of different types of innovation or social initiatives. The problem is that they're microscopic. Frequently, an entire region has to split between them money for innovation through the regional development funds that is equivalent to what one company gets out of one grant application to the Technology Development Fund. And not to speak of the tax breaks for research and development. The regional development funds are micro grants, regrettably. And they also usually are attached to a policy document for the specific region that they're in. And almost always there is an incentive to create jobs, to look at the strengths and weaknesses of that particular region and to solve local challenges. So this is a certain way of thinking about innovation. I personally enjoy thinking about innovation more like the regional development funds, but I do think also they sometimes have too much of a narrow idea of innovation, specifically in this push to create jobs or think about your own strengths and weaknesses. All right, so tying the knot on this with us, Magdalena talked about finding the true meaning of the buzzwords. And I guess what I'm going to invite you to do, if you have time to stick around and chat after this, is to think with me about what could be the true understanding of words like innovation. What could we think of when we think of innovation? We could think that innovation requires not just the demand to create value, but a conversation on values. Whether we have the conversation or not, innovation proceeds with a certain definition of value. And perhaps we would be better off if there was a conversation. Values meaning what is valuable to us as individuals, as a society, as a community, as a nation. What are our values? Where do we want to head towards? We could think that innovation is something that entails the transformation of the whole of society, remembering that Kodak couldn't make a digital camera as a box in and of itself. For digital cameras to exist and be used in society, there were thousands of different transformations that needed to happen: social habits, infrastructure, policies, and so forth. So the process of innovation is always a process of a collective transformation. We could think that innovation is carried out by diverse actors, from the women's organizations, even through trade unions, to what the government is doing, the education system. This is all a part of the innovative process. It is not contained by a businessman or a particular type of an entrepreneur or something like that. We could acknowledge that innovation eliminates jobs and requires a conversation of where the value goes to. We should acknowledge that innovation operates globally and it can turn weaknesses into strengths. And to not fall into what I sometimes perceive as the trap of the regional policy documents attached to the regional development funds, to be too narrowly looking at your own region as a starting point for innovation. And so maybe innovation should be thought of a little bit like the pages of What People Do All Day by Richard Scarry, sort of like a collection of all kinds of people doing all kinds of things that emerges as something when you glance through it, but then you kind of have to look at each figure, each activity, each thing, and trying to kind of see how this whole thing is emerging towards. And we might want to think about different ways of supporting innovation with that framing in mind. We do accelerators that in the original configuration are about creating economic value very fast, and either dying very fast or scaling 10x and ideally becoming a unicorn. But maybe we need to be looking into making decelerators that slow us down and make us think about the values that we embody when we create our things. We could be exploring generators. We could be exploring ways to start with a specific social challenge and then try to solve that and then come up with companies that then can generate economic value. We could work in missions like Mariana Mazzucato, who visited Iceland last week, has talked about. We could be thinking of how the government can coordinate society, remembering from the Kodak example that innovation requires the whole of society to move in unison, or at least in some sort of collaborative way. How the government can actually steer us in directions of solving social challenges. We could acknowledge that the commons, that the Christmas cat that nobody pays for seeing in the square in downtown Reykjavik is also value creating. And often this is the easiest way to create value. And we could be thinking more of communities rather than companies or formal entities when we support innovation. We can think differently about it. We can move our moonshots into the hometowns, and we have to acknowledge that not having a conversation about it is also a decision. Not thinking about towards what kind of a world are we trying to move when we support innovation does not mean that we are not making assumptions, does not mean that we are not being political. It just means that we're not talking about it. It just means that we haven't invited for a conversation. So with these rude words that innovation is political, that I understand why it might trigger some people, we should ask these questions and we should debate the consequences of them, and we should make it problematic to think about innovation. It shouldn't be just like a support for the national team where we all come together and applaud the handball team. We shouldn't be applauding the new unicorns. We should be having debates where we have real differences and real different values about how we are going to build innovation and the economies and the societies of the future. That was the end of my presentation. I hope I have given you the true meaning of the words.